Meeting has been duly called and notice of the meeting has been posted for the time and manner required by law. It appears that we do not have any cards, so we're going to go ahead and press forward. And I am going to turn it over to Lisa Wilson first so she can get us started on all of the things that we need to get through today. So Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you. We have several items on the agenda today. The first thing we will cover with Dr. Callahan will be the STAR 2021 assessment results. We will also cover the early reading instrument results, which is a TEA requirement, so we will share all of that with you. We will also do a Proclamation 2022 update, which includes the health and PE area. And then we will do a quick legislative update from Senate Bill 15, which recently discussed virtual learning. So we'll have all of that throughout today's agenda. So I'm going to turn it over very quickly to Dr. Jamie Callahan, and I believe she has already left for you on your desk some additional materials that she's going to give you a chance to look at and discuss as she goes through. And I'm going to hand you this clicker. You're welcome.
And just so members of the audience know, when someone is speaking or more than 6 feet apart, have our masks down more than likely so we can hear better. Thank you.
You'll have to turn that on. Perfect. Let's get started.
Today we're going to be reviewing the 2020-2021 STAR assessment results as required by TEA to be presented to the board. Our targets for today are a few. We're going to review the state assessment results, which were also part of the board report that was submitted. We're going to try to understand some relationships between the different sets of data, understand how the results fall within our district goals, and then highlight some positive gains for reasons to celebrate. This chart was also from the board report, and it summarizes our STAR results for every subject area and every grade level from this past year all the way through 2015-16. This data is available to the public, and it's posted annually in the Texas Academic Performance Report called TAPER, and the 2021 data will be available in TAPER later this fall, and I will then again come present to you regarding what's in the TAPER report. So this chart was provided so that you could get an idea of the different performance levels that STAR measures, which are approaches, meets, and masters. Throughout the presentation, I will highlight the different parts of this particular picture, but you also have handouts that will help paint a larger, bigger picture of the entire story. As a district, we began to focus on master's grade level, and it was increasing, as you can see, and yet even this past year, it's still higher, even though we had a pandemic, than it was in 15-16. And we also have done a lot of work in reading, and luckily that definitely kept us from slipping more than we did. We were impacted by COVID, but definitely not as much as some of our districts around us, so that's another piece of data that I'll be sharing with you today.
Can I ask you a quick question? On that slide where you have the percentages, like for instance, for the 2020-21 school year, all those 3 percentages don't add up to 100%. So like can you explain what they mean or what we're looking at?
Sure. So the approaches level, which is in blue at the top, includes also the students who met meets and who met master's level, which then indicates that 5% of our students did not meet the approaches grade level, which would add up to 100. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. There are many lenses that we can view data through, and in the handouts that are in front of you, we're going to present a few different views of our data. The first one is the district, obviously us, the region, and the state results. These are scores from 2 years. The intent of my presentation was to present this year's data, but I thought it would also be valuable to see the last time our students tested, since we did have the gap year in the middle, and also included 2019. It's a comparison of HPISD to our scores from the region and the state, and it includes all subjects and all grade levels. It's a very large handout, and this is an example of what it looks like. And we'll go through this and use it to go through our STAR data shortly. Another view we can look at is HPISD and some comparison districts. We are often compared to Carroll and Eanes. Those are the two districts that we're most often compared to. So you have our district compared with their scores from this year and also 2019. In addition to this, throughout the presentation, I've also included Lake Travis ISD and Alamo Heights to show you an even larger variety of comparison for districts that we're often compared to. And then finally, there is a smaller page which has cohort data to see the same students groups growth over multiple years, because it's occasionally it's valuable to see how a group of students progressed from this last time they took a similar test. So if you have that smaller page in front of you, it's the small one. Yes. And you want it, I'll explain how this page works. If you take a look at 5th grade reading, so if you find 5th grade reading, it's toward the bottom of your table. You can see the 2021 scores on the left, and then you can see the last time these students tested in 2019 when they were in 3rd grade on the right. And what you can see there, and also red indicates a drop, green indicates a rise in comparison, and yellow indicates no change. So what this shows is that the 5th graders improved from 3rd to 5th grade in the meets and masters performance level. So with all the variables present in STAR reporting, it's beneficial sometimes to look at our data in that viewpoint. So I'd like to present that to you as well.
Jamie, real quick, over the years the STAR test has changed. So when we're looking across cohorts, for example, the 2019 was under the old set of TEKS, and this past year, obviously TEKS changed considerably. So this year's TEKS, or this year's STAR test that was just taken, was blended, right? Old TEKS and new TEKS. And now this coming year, 2022, will be all new TEKS. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and so when we look multiple years over, like in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, was that the first year that the STAR test changed which year was the year that it changed pretty radically?
Well, from 15-16 to 16-17, we changed from a different performance reporting system to approaches meets masters.
Okay. And then after that, so it's just important when we're looking at the data to understand that the TEKS did change, and now last year was blended from old and new, and this year will be all new.
That is correct. And so the ELA TEKS specifically changed in 1920. And so you're correct. There was an overlap of TEKS that they were tested on that year, and then last year, but then this year they're only going to test it.
And so the ELA data from 2019 was it was blended or old?
It was all
Old. Okay. Thank you.
because that was
Sorry, that was the 18-19 school year before the TEKS changed. So the first year the TEKS changed was 1920, and there was no STAR test during that year.
Thank you.
I thought it was important for you to see this has already been reported, and it's also on our website, HPISD website, that all districts this year will still be rated, not rated, declared state of disaster. So even though we administered STAR, TEA decided that the effects of the pandemic were such that it would limit the ability to appropriately rate districts. So the purpose of STAR this past year was really to identify learning gaps due to COVID, and to help districts make a plan for closing those gaps. And HB 4545 is an excellent example of one of the ways that we have this year to start working on closing those learning gaps that were in place due to that, due to the effects of the pandemic.
And Jamie, one other thing in math, it looks like the year-over-year cohort comparison has come down. Have there been changes? I mean, I'm just thinking back to, we had a district goal to increase the number of students that were taking Algebra 1 by 8th grade. And so has that, do you think, been a factor in some of the changes in our math scores? For example, if you're a 7th or an 8th grader taking Algebra 1, you take the end of course, which goes into the end of course for high school. It doesn't go into, even if you're a 7th or 8th grade, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So that does have an impact, and we'll see that also. You're right. And when we talk about, I'm going to break down each subject area. When we get to math, we can talk even more about that anomaly for sure.
Do you mind backing up just one slide?
Sure.
And I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. When I am looking at like 5th grade reading, and then I compare to the data, the big data, I'm looking at 5th grade reading percent meets. And on the kind of big data sheet, 5th grade reading percent meets, said in 2019 we were at 87%, and in 2021 we're at 80%.
You have to skip a grade, Mary Jane, for the cohort, because those students did not, the last time those 5th grade reading students tested was in 3rd grade. So you'd have to go back to 3rd grade data reading for that cohort.
Okay.
It's not a normal cohort look. Usually you can look the year before, but because there was no STAR test, we had to go back to those scores as 3rd graders.
So if I was looking at this sheet of paper and looking at 2019 scores to compare, I would look at 3rd grade.
You'd have to look at 3rd grade reading to
2019.
compare to the 5th graders from 21.
So in 2019, 3rd grade reading was at 77.
Correct.
And in 2021, 5th grade reading is at 80.
Correct.
So we went up 3%.
Correct. But yes, we like to make things as confusing as possible for y'all, so that's, yeah, apologies for that, but that she did try to put which tests, which grade, which year and which grade level for the cohort, just so you can see that comparison.
And it's not you were confusing us. I know it's this, but I just want to clarify so we can all track with what we're looking at. Thank you.
There are some differences, and I tried to note those on the side of this sheet because you can't always compare. For example, like 7th grade has to be compared to 4th grade, and for the same test to be comparable.
And you
So
said that. Thank you for just
Which is-
repeating it.
Yeah, which is the same reason you won't see 4th grade or 3rd grade on a cohort, because our 4th graders last year, that was their first time to take a STAR test, because they would have taken it as 3rd graders in 1920, but it was not administered.
Okay, that helps me. Thank you. All right.
Like I said, we're going to break down and quickly run through each of the subject areas that contain a test that students take. And the first one is going to be reading. And this is the report that was provided in the board notes. And this reflects reading performance at all performance levels, approaches, meets, and masters for every grade level that took a reading exam, including English 1 and English 2 EOC. Sometimes there's some confusion about STAR. STAR and EOC are really the same thing. They just call it end of course because it's required for graduation. So we've got, you can see on this report our scores in approaches, meets, and masters for every single grade level that tested this last year. During any given year, there are other variables that affect performance, and we've talked about some of those already. There are obviously changes in the TEKS, most recently ELA. There's changes in the number of test questions that are on each test. There are changes to the test questions themselves because they're always looking at their validity and reliability, so they make changes in actual test questions. And then the test scores for determining each performance level can fluctuate from year to year as well. So it is like a moving target.
So just going back to my question, why is it not helpful to look at like 5th grade this year versus 5th grade 2 years ago?
It is. It's still a very good way to look at our scores to see the progress. It's just sometimes looking at one group of kids and then tracking that same exact group of kids gives us another view.
Okay.
So 5th grade to 5th grade, Mary Jane, you'll see on the bigger sheet.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a state and region comparison of specifically 3rd grade reading. And what I thought we would do for just a minute is take a look at your charts and just focus on the reading section, just the reading results. So if you have preferably the state and region comparison in front of you, I just wanted to give you a moment to look at the reading results for each grade level, 3rd through English 2, and see what observations you might be able to make about potential learning loss due to COVID. Is there anything you'd like clarification on or that you would like to point out?
A couple things jump out at me, Lisa. And first and foremost is that, as we normatively do, that we outperform the state and the region across all reading and writing. It looks like that, interestingly enough, we had, even in the middle of a pandemic, we did have, and changing TEKS and a whole host of other things, we did have a fairly normal, where English stays fairly at the same rate. If it does drop, you can see where it drops pretty readily, and it's dropped by an average of probably 4 to 5 points. So that's something that we'll need to keep an eye on. We did have some increases in regards to 7th grade reading. I noticed where 7th grade writing went up by 3 points, reading stayed the same. So it looks like that it could have been overall worse, and that our losses as a collective compared to the other state and region wasn't as great, but that it is something that we'll need to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Absolutely, and it's also nice to remember this is just one data point. It's just one piece of the picture that we paint. We've got many other assessments in place that will help paint a better picture and show more growth for each individual student over time, whereas this is just one day in the spring and in one test. So I agree. We definitely have some work to do, but I think we have some good data to help us take that journey. Anyone else have a comment?
It did look like the most significant decreases were in 8th grade reading. Did you guys take note of that?
We did.
And is there any particular reason that we think that that class was impacted more than the others?
I know that it probably had to do with their we have new curriculum, there were new TEKS. It may have had something to do with that, as well as the implementation of the new curriculum that we put in place, and how that works with the teacher's understanding of the new TEKS, which I know there was a great deal of training involved in getting teachers comfortable with the way the TEKS were redesigned, because it was quite significantly different. But in my opinion, it could have had something to do with that.
Yeah, I'll just say that the losses appear negligible, except for like the percentage of masters in 8th grade went down from 64% to 48%, and this is 8th grade reading, and the percentage meets went down from 92 to 77, which seems fairly significant.
Right, and definitely something that we have our eyes on and are planning for as we work through this school year as well. And we'll talk more about some of the board goals that pertain to these as well, and how we think those can help push us in the right direction. I thought it would be appropriate to show you another comparison. This was done for Richardson ISD, however, you may have seen this during convocation as well, and it shows HPISD in comparison to other Dallas districts. And what I find compelling about this is 3rd grade reading at the meets performance level, and Highland Park, even as the highest performing, actually made gains where no one else made gains. So in the midst of what have been happening, I think that's notable to point out.
Lisa, can I go back on one other thing, something Bryce said, also, we also had a greater number of kids not take STAR. I don't know what grades those were across, but is that also playing a role in this? And is there a way to look at the data to pull out the kids that didn't take it and see what it looks like?
Yeah,
Similarly?
we're trying not to sound defensive or make
No,
excuses,
no,
but yeah, those types of things are all context to the data, and we did have a large number, particularly at the middle school level, who chose to not come in and take the STAR, and that does impact it. And so we have taken a look at those students and how they would have performed had they taken it, and yes, we are making the hypothesis that those would have been higher had some of those students tested, but that's
all
certainly
hypothesis.
speculation, so
Right.
it's not hard data.
But one of the things that if we wanted to take a look to try to have more of an apples to apples comparison, would we have the ability to take out the students from the year that everyone tested and then do a comparison that way? Or do we not get that granular level of data?
We might be
Okay.
able to.
I know you can project forward in terms
Right.
of how you think they would have done, but I didn't know if we could pull out and actually have apples to apples that way. But it just suddenly dawned on me when Bryce said about 7th and 8th grade that I remember that was one of the areas where we most impacted by students not coming in, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Interestingly, our performance or our participation level for STAR is traditionally 100%, and it was 98%. So the bulk of that was definitely in middle school.
Thank you.
That's a good point to make. Thank you. In another display, you can see although we did have some loss, if you look at 3 through 8 meets level reading performance altogether, it wasn't near as great as if some of our neighboring districts were. And just put some other perspective.
Jamie or Lisa, these last two slides, can you give us a little perspective? I mean, it says commit down at the bottom. What does that mean? Who did this data? Why did they do it? Why are we sharing it? I mean,
Sure.
it's so different than what we've seen so far.
There's an organization called Commit that keeps a really close eye on Dallas County scores, and is a partnership that is put together to improve scores in Dallas County. And so they keep a really close eye. And why we didn't make any of the headlines, I don't know if Richardson called for this study in particular or not, but they seem to always make the headline rather than Highland Park, even if it's higher, which is fine. But it is an interesting, or was an interesting comparison for us, just to see in terms of overall learning loss. When we keep telling you, our losses were not as significant, we wanted you to see some of those numbers to see that we weren't just making that up.
Great. I wanted you to see this as well. This is similar to what you have with Carroll ISD and Eames ISD. However, I added Alamo Heights and Lake Travis to just this particular graphic because we are often compared to them as well. And I just want you to take a look at it for a minute and tell me what you notice.
And also, the legend on the bottom is not the same. It's how it was in the data file rather than compared how. So if you will look at the colors, Carroll is up there on the top. They typically are on top in reading and have been for at least as far back as 10 years that I've looked. And then Highland Park is next. The yellow then is representing Eames. The darker blue is Lake Travis, and the orange is Alamo Heights.
Anybody see something interesting? I do.
There's only one increase per year.
That's right. I think that's worth noting. We did increase. We're one of the only districts in this comparison that actually made an increase. But you saw that also compared to Dallas County.
So South Lake Carroll, I just am curious. I know that they're always held out there for their reading. What do we know if anything, have you contacted them? What do they do?
That they have used the workshop model for at least 10 years. When I spoke with their ELA department a while back, they've used with fidelity the workshop model in reading, and they've done pretty well.
We mentioned this earlier. Oh, did you have a question?
Well, I would love to see that in the masters category. Would it look
You have that
similar,
on your sheet in front of you.
but compared with all of those
Oh.
districts?
We can get that for you. We just didn't want to put together
I get
426
it.
slides.
This is a beast. I get it.
Yes, that's no problem. We mentioned that there are board goals that are focusing on early childhood this one focuses on early childhood literacy. And this shows the goal compared with the actual results for 2021. And while we would have obviously loved to have met the goals, it speaks to the specific needs of students due to the disruptions during this school year.
Which shows you we still have work to do. If we want to get to the 84 by 2025, which we certainly do, and we believe we can, we continue to work hard to get to that goal. Disappointed that we didn't make our 80 that we wanted, but taking some comfort that we went from 77 to 78. You'll see here in a minute, we're wishing we had that same, we wish math would look the same, but it seems as though math took a greater hit in the pandemic than reading.
So Lisa, along those lines, I know when you look at years prior to this, because that's something that we were doing when I was doing the data person for the board. We did drop off prior to, we were higher and then we came down. I know when we took a look at that, part of that was changing test was a big part of that, and there were some other things that we looked at that made looking at the data. From what year now has it been where you would consider it pretty consistent for us to be comparing the year over years we're doing?
I would say 17, it's either 17, 18, or 18, 19. That first couple of years they made some minor tweaks, but the state has made a commitment to being a little more consistent,
Okay.
which should help us in the next few years. What didn't help us was not having a year's worth of data,
Right.
and then having a year with a great big asterisk for context
Right.
in 2021. But
If you could,
Because we have no, sorry, I know I'm late, you probably reviewed. Because the STAR tests were canceled in the spring of 20.
Correct.
So we have no data from the 1920 school year, so we're, okay.
correct.
if you go, I'm still thinking about the last slide, if you don't mind, I'm always a little bit slow. If I'm looking quickly at like the math scores that we have in front of me from Carol and Eames, and it looks like we would look very similar if we were comparing the math scores, like the graph would look similar to the reading scores, and Carol would be ahead of us.
Yes.
And so going back to the question of like, what's the difference? And is there any room for like districts teaching to the test more than other districts? Is that a question mark in our head as a differentiator?
I don't think that's something we would make that, we would not make that claim.
Yeah. Is there anything in the math department that shows why there would be a difference? Or anything that we know that we can speak to?
Well, those are great questions with math, and while we did a lot of work in reading to look at our practices and tried to update our practices from the last couple of years in reading, we're doing the very same in math right now. So we have a math committee that will be launching this year to begin really looking at are we allowing students to accelerate like we should, and are we providing the most rigorous math instruction for all students. So that is our chore this year, and we certainly hope that we don't get distracted from that by any outside influences.
Speaking of math, let's move on to that. And again, this was from the report to give you a picture, and this is what Stacy brought up before. As you can see, there's a dip in 7th and 8th grade, and it's worth adding that those two grade levels have students that are participating in Algebra 1 and Geometry at this point. And so those students take a completely separate assessment. They take the Algebra 1 EOC and their scores are not part of 7th and 8th grade, the 7th and 8th grade math test. So that it can give you some context as to why perhaps those scores are dipping slightly with those students who are performing highly in Algebra 1 have been removed from the equation.
What percentage of students do we think that is?
There were about 30 7th graders and 242 8th graders, almost half.
Okay, so you're seeing a dip because you're taking those for whom math is probably a very strong suit, and they're now not counted in the overall. You're leaving everyone who has not chosen to take Algebra 1 in their 7th or 8th grade and rather would take it in 9th grade. And that,
Correct.
so you're going to see probably a pullback if you remove all those
Yes.
students.
The happy news with that is, you know, there are some folks who feel like if you put too many students in algebra in 8th grade and they're not ready, they won't perform well. But when you look at the Algebra 1 EOC results, that does not pan out. So,
They do really well.
And Jamie and Lisa, 6th grade was accelerated for the first time last year or this year, or the year before, when we started offering,
I believe I believe they've had an accelerated option for several. I couldn't tell you the exact number of years, but it's been intact for a while.
okay.
But, so last thing, if half of the students that were part of the 54%, well, that's actually not right. Okay. Anyways, it's helping to explain why 54% in 6th grade drops to 27%.
Correct. In 8th grade.
Okay.
Hey Jamie, I do think that makes sense with regard to, you know, HPISD and the number of kids doing algebra, but when you look at 7th math and 8th math compared to Carroll and Eanes, there appears to be a discrepancy. And I would assume they have similar situation in terms of 8th grade kids taking algebra.
I think they do. I don't know what their stats are as far as how many students they have participating in higher level math, but I do believe those their numbers are still higher than ours, 7th and 8th grade, which speaks to the need for our development of our math framework, which is coming together, and also looking at the math curriculum.
I mean, looking at the percentage of kids mastering 8th grade math, we're at 41 and Carroll's at 71. I mean, that seems significant.
It does. Definitely have some work to do.
And the math committee, are they addressing these types of questions?
Mary,
Yes.
you didn't say that.
That is the work ahead of us for sure.
Again, if you take just a moment to examine the math scores, I wanted to give you just a little bit of time. I know we're edging near the end of my time, but to just look at the math scores in general.
Which I think it sounds like they've jumped ahead and they're already looking
They
at
already
those
are.
math scores.
I think so too. You can see a similar comparison with the other Dallas County schools with our 4th grade math performance at the meets level. I know, Mary Jane, you mentioned masters, but this is still the meets level and how we definitely outperformed our neighbors. Although we did see a dip, we still outperformed where our neighbors were as far as Dallas County goes. And overall as well, definitely had a drop from previous years. However, we still rose above. So even in the midst of what happened, we were doing well. And in algebra, we had a gain. So we gained, and that's a large part due to our 8th graders and 7th graders who are in algebra. They helped push that up. This is what I believe you were asking for, Mary Jane. We have 4th grade math masters. And again, like Lisa mentioned earlier, Carroll is orange on top, we're beneath them in that blue, and then gray is Eanes, yellow Lake Travis, and Alamo Heights is at the bottom. So what do you notice about this?
When we looked at the earlier one where I asked about math and masters, were we looking at third grade reading?
We were at third grade reading.
Okay,
Yes. I just picked highlights out from the data.
okay.
I choose to highlight. Because I feel like this one shows that there were only 2 districts that actually showed improvement. Ourselves and Eaton's. And although Carroll still was on top, they did make a drop.
I can only attest to one data point, which is my own child, Jamie. But I do know that she said that hybrid was particularly challenging for math at the high school level, namely because it was hard to interact both with the students online and with the students in the classroom in a way that was meeting both people's needs. And so I don't know if that's the experience of all students. I know we had some students that absolutely thrived in that kind of environment. But she did say of all of her subjects that math was the most challenging for her, at least personally, in a hybrid environment.
Well, I want to remind you what the landscape looked like last year for, and this will help our conversation here in a minute, but at elementary, remember, we dedicated virtual classrooms. So those teachers were working only with virtual students or only with in-person students. When you hit 5th grade and above, even if you were an in-person learner, your teacher was a dual instruction teacher because you had virtual students at home, whether you were hybrid or you were a virtual student. So that did change the landscape of those classrooms from 5th to 12th grade last year. And it does seem, like I mentioned, it does seem to have impacted math more than it did reading.
This is a picture of Algebra 1 EOC at the NEETS grade level. It kind of reminds me of one of those train equations. It looks a little bit of a mess, but what you can see here as our line, which is the darker blue, was the one that rose to the top in 2021. And I thought that was significant. We do also have an early childhood math board outcome goal, and like Lisa mentioned, we were hit harder in math, so our actual report is lower than our goal, but we still have a goal of reaching 85% by 2025, which is why we have so many strategies in place to help change this trajectory and move up. And this specifically is for the NEETS grade level.
This is a bit of a stretch, but what I'm taking away from this is further evidence of why our leadership thought it was best to not offer a virtual option when we were analyzing that in May and June. And honestly, why the state legislature also came to the same conclusion, long before Delta was a thing in June and July, when they were trying to determine what will they fund, what will they not fund, what will they encourage and not encourage. I know that anecdotally that this data was driving a lot of those decisions. And I know a lot of things changed when kind of late July and August happened, but this is reaffirming why we made the decisions we made back in June.
And again, the changes, although we certainly never want to go down, and we would love for us to have met our goal last year beyond what we had, but again, ours was minimal compared to the rest of the state. And so yes, I think you are correct. And I think the other anecdotal evidence we had was listening to the teachers and understanding how difficult it was to try to do dual instruction all day, every day, and how it impacted their ability to do some of the things they wanted to do.
I just want to circle back in regards to many of the same students that didn't show up for STAR for reading didn't show up for STAR for math. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In addition to board goals, we also have district improvement plan goals that are aimed at master's grade level for all subject areas. And just wanted to bring up that because we are always looking at data and always looking at ways to improve. So obviously we have some work to do. It'll be up to the DLC to identify ways to improve and decide upon what goals we should have going forward and how we should work on those goals. Maybe not the best picture, but it is part of a bigger goal of improvement going forward. And we did pick the most lofty goal of master's level to pursue, and did see some gains.
Yeah, it was quite a kick in the gut. You'll notice from the first slide that we had, we were at 53% in 18-19 on masters. We had really improved that number, and then after the COVID years, we've dropped to 45, which is a huge kick in the gut for us. But that is the loftiest level, and we will continue to keep our eyes on it, continue to focus on that.
In the area of science, you can see we test science in 3 different grade levels, 5th, 8th, and biology. I think it's interesting to see it trending upward, and as you would expect for students to continue learning and developing their level of knowledge in science. You may have already taken a look at the science report, the science data in your reports. If you'd like to take a few seconds, or if you have any questions about our science data.
I know that state and region comparisons are not necessarily something that this board is extremely concerned about. I don't think anyone has ever been concerned that we would not meet the state averages. But I believe it's important for you to see those, because you can also notice fluctuations in the testing when when you look at that, did the state and region also go down? If we went down, could that have been, and again, I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm trying to share with you all the different pieces of context that we put together when we try to look at data. So that might be helpful. Not necessarily that you're worried that we're not going to meet the state average.
And then for social studies, we take social studies in 8th grade, and then U.S. history, which is typically 11th grade.
This was a huge celebration point for us at Convocation when we shared the 100%, meeting the standard in U.S. history during a global pandemic. That was that again shows you the amazing work of our teachers, our students, our families. That's a real celebration.
And Lisa, if I'm not mistaken, they had reworked the actual in-class experience for APUSH. They basically made it longer and deeper in subjects that were, especially for APUSH, associated with the AP exam. And so there was still a great volume of reading, but it was much more specific and much more aligned with both the TEKS and the AP. Is that not correct?
Yes,
And
AP definitely did some slimming down during the pandemic to really get focused on a few things.
Again, I believe you probably had time to look at your results for social studies in those 2 grade levels.
Just remember, we're not crazy. I know we just said it was 100%. That's the meets grade level. So.
Yes. Finally, we have writing. And our writing points.
Was it meets or was it approaches?
That was
The 100.
That was 100.
That's actually meets.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
For our writing assessment, we tested in 4th grade and 7th grade. It is notable that that as much as we'd love the state to give us some consistency, they're not going to. That we will be no longer having a 4th and 7th grade separate writing assessment starting this year. It will be embedded into the reading assessments. So they will no longer have 4th or 7th grade writing as a separate assessment. And
So that's aligning with the new TEKS, right? Which is basically, we're not gonna have reading and writing, that it should be all exemplified in what we know as English. So that means that the new test that we were talking about, that's all new TEKS, it will be, for the lack of a better word, blended? Where
Correct.
basically we no longer, I don't know how they're gonna make them demonstrate the writing piece of it.
They talk about the integration of skills, and
Okay.
so, yes.
That's correct. Again, this is writing at the meets grade level for us. This is specifically seventh grade. You probably had a moment to look at the fourth and seventh grade writing. And in addition to the change I just talked to you about, there are other notable changes in the STAR assessment that are going to be occurring this year and next year. We are transitioning 100% online as required by the state. That has to occur by 22-23 school year. In addition to that, there are new STAR item types. Those are being standalone field tested this year. We were selected to be part of the standalone field test for 4 of our campuses in specific grade levels and subject areas. Do not count. They are not part of the actual STAR assessment. It's separate so that TE can get an idea of how kids would do. It's just a sampling. And those are open-ended type questions because there is now going to be a cap on multiple choice questions, and it's limited to 75% of the test, which means 25% of the test has to be some sort of open-ended question. So for every single subject area, there are select different question types that will be tested, field tested this year, and they will be included starting next year. So the scenery is going to change again.
And Jamie was sweet when she said we were selected. We were told we were part of that pilot testing, which is fine because we're going to use that as an opportunity to learn more and understand the questions more. And again, it won't negatively impact us. It will just be work for our teachers and students, but hopefully we'll learn and grow from that.
And that's what the STAR test is moving towards, so they're just doing the standalone testing versus embedding it and testing like they've done before to test questions.
Correct.
Okay, so that, number one, I have a lot of questions. Okay. Number one, for the required online, if we have students on 504 IEPs that have to have it on paper, we are still allowed to do that?
That's correct, but I will tell you most of the accommodations are actually provided with the technology. So that's an it depends,
Right.
but
So in the case of a student that needs test questions read to them, it may or may not depend if it's answered on paper. Or
That is
depending on
through-
what their
correct.
IEP or 504
Yeah.
says.
But if you needed, let's say, for some reason you just had to have a paper version and that was in your IEP, we would work with the state on that.
Number two, do we know who will be grading the open-ended questions?
I do not know how they'll be scored and if they will be that information. We haven't received that yet as far as if they will be scaled differently than
Right.
the actual multiple choice, which I would assume they are. Because there are multiple parts to one question, if you get some of them right, or does that count toward the answer? So all of those are answers we're still waiting for.
And that will go for mathematics too, where there's going to be open-ended questions that aren't multiple choice?
There'll be graphing. We did a presentation during back to school professional learning for teachers to show them what some of the new item types look like in every subject. It's all the tested subject areas, so all 4 areas.
And the other issue is, especially on this new, basically blended reading, writing, there has been questions in the past on the qualifications of the graders. And so are you hearing anything about who will actually be reading those and what their qualifications are?
Great question.
So much for consistency from year to year, being able to compare.
When you guys said that, I thought, oh, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But are there any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll just say thank you for preparing all that data. It's a lot, and to get it in a format that we can read and understand is complex, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your suggestions, and we went over this with you initially, so I appreciate your feedback as well.
Yeah, I just want to say, you guys, considering the challenges of last year, you did a great job, and we, more or less maintained our scores. I'm glad that you've identified room for improvement in 7-8 math. I think it would be helpful at our next workshop to have an update maybe from the math committee about what's going on.
Yeah, we actually have not had our first meeting
Okay.
yet, but we will definitely keep you informed as we.
And I didn't point this out during the presentation on science, but if you look at 8th grade science, compared to Carroll and Eanes, it looks like there's similar room for improvement, so just to make sure we're aware of that.
And that would hold true for elementary as well. But meaning we know that we need to turn our attentions to science as well. Okay, any more for Jamie? All right, thank you, Jamie. All right, I'd like to welcome Kim Brooks. We have another set of assessments that are given in the early reading instrument, and I asked her to do kind of a high-level overview for you so you could see what our reading results look like.
Good afternoon. We have started using last year in the 2020-21 school year an assessment called M-Class, and it's also known as DIBELS in other areas, and the vendor is Amplify Texas. So those are a lot of words that you kind of hear synonymously. And one of the reasons we began using this was it was part of a HB3 requirement from 2019 that kindergarten students be tested using either this instrument or another one that was developed by the state of Texas. And since we also have to do early reading assessments on our K2 students in whole, we thought we would use this one to provide some consistency, because this was the only one that could have multi-grade levels within it. Obviously last year we had students that were virtual, so depending on the status of the student, this was either administered face-to-face or virtually from the beginning of the year all the way through the end of the year. And these tests by M-Class replace the subtests that we used to use by Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system that assess the same things about phonemic awareness, phonics, word, reading, all of those kind of early literacy skills. We do still use Fountas and Pinnell at the K4 grade level and sometimes even above to do running records on students' reading levels and to get sort of a more global picture of their reading. But again, the M-Class assessment replaced the individual subtests that we were using from Fountas and Pinnell. So a little bit more about the subtests, and I'm not going to dive as deep as Jamie did with STAR, but there are several subtests per level, and I'll show you a different slide with all of those subtests. Most are 1 minute, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. One of the differences sort of between Fountas and Pinnell and M-Class is that Fountas and Pinnell you had a list maybe of 100 words, and it was exhaustive, meaning the kids had to read all 100 words, and in this case, you might still have a list of 100 words, but it's timed to a minute, so it's whether or not the student gets through 20 words or 50 words or 75 words is kind of dependent on their skill level, so it's in context of fluency within that minute. They are interactive with the teacher, so the teacher, as they're assessing, has parts to play during that 1 minute. And you'll see on another slide, we kind of found out during our first year of this how that kind of plays a part in the test. And then the important thing to note is we do have benchmark scores that show where students fall in the different subtests. Mostly, all of the subtests have green, yellow, and blue, which are benchmark, below benchmark, or well below benchmark. And then some of the subtests have I'm sorry, I said green, yellow, blue. Green, yellow, and red. Some of the subtests have a blue level, which is above benchmark. It just depends on the test itself, because, for instance, one of the tests in kindergarten is letter naming, and there's a finite amount of letters that they can name. So there's no such thing as above naming those letters. So it kind of just depends. But for most of our tests, you'll see a range of red, yellow, green, and blue based on how they performed. And then we also had an additional dyslexia screener available to us through M-Class. This is in addition to Shaywitz, which we started using, I believe, in 2017-18 school year. That's part of a state requirement as well. We had our early literacy committee do some research on different dyslexia screeners out there and found found Shaywitz to be the best one, and you'll see in a minute, I'll show you some data that we gathered from in-class and kind of how that might compare to the Shaywitz data.
And real quick, Tim.
Yes.
Just real quick question. Can you sort of describe the difference between the two screeners, between M-Class,
Sure.
Shaywitz, and how they're administered? Because I think that that's important to the discussion.
So dyslexia screener on in-class, and we use the word screener because it's not an identifier. This is, they would still have to go through a process to be identified. But the screener in in-class is 3 parts. There's a spelling test, which again is timed. There's a vocabulary test, and there's rapid automatized naming. So that's trying to see in a minute how many things they can process. In this case, the RAN is not actually letters. They use numbers on purpose. So it's numbers kind of flashing before them, like 3, 7, 8, 6, and they have to see how many they can say in 1 minute's time. Shaywitz is administered differently. It is actually not the student doing the screener, it's the teacher stepping back and informing how the student has performed in class. The norm group is usually just typical peers, so whether you're in kindergarten or first grade, how are they performing? It goes into a lot of language issues, which we know is an indicator, or could be used as an indicator for screening for dyslexia. Also things like, do they like reading or not? So some of those are obviously subjective to how the kids perform, but important data nonetheless.
I think I might also note, and Kim may say this, so I'm sorry if I jumped ahead. We found that the Shaywitz gives us a little bit of a wider net of students to keep our eyes on, and so we would like to keep, we've chosen to keep both in place because we think they inform different things and provide us with more information on our students. So in terms of, we're required to give one, we've opted to do 2 because we feel like it gives us better information.
And that's for every student that's K through 2.
K1 does Shaywitz, and K2 within in-class has the dyslexia screener attached to it. And there are different times of the year that those occur, and again, those are state mandated. So here is a comprehensive subtest list for K2. It's important to note when you look at this, not all of these subtests are for every grade level. As you can imagine, skills change from K to 1 to 2. For example, reading comprehension does not occur in the in-class test at K and 1. It only occurs at 2nd grade. So we don't have that consistent data from year to year. Letter names, for example, occurs at kindergarten, and again in 1st grade if they did not test out of it. So let me just really quickly go through, and letter names, of course, are identifying letters of the alphabet. It's a visual identification, so there are both capital and lowercase letters. Phonemic segmentation fluency is one measure of phonemic awareness. There are many things to do with phonemic awareness, but this one in particular is segmentation. So it is not visual at all. There are no letters associated with it, no graphics associated with it. It's saying a word, so this is again that interactive piece. If I'm the teacher and I say the word dog, you don't have to know how to spell it, you don't have to know that it starts with a D. What you have to know are the sounds in the word dog. So to segment the word dog, you would say d-a-g. And so therefore, if a word was larger, the sounds and the letters don't necessarily have to match up because it's only about the sounds. So a word, for instance, like phone, has 5 letters, but it only has 3 sounds attached to it. So this is only about the sounds. Letter sounds does associate letters with sounds, as the name suggests. In this case, they're using nonsense words to identify whether the student understands that relationship and the correspondence between letters and sounds. So you'll have words, I say in quotation mark, like HAP, H-A-P. We know that's not a word, but they're still using phonics to identify the letter sound correspondence to say the word correctly. And again, all of these are 1-minute tests with an interactive teacher component. Decoding, again, it's can the student decode, meaning, basically read the word out loud through matching the letters and sounds. These two are nonsense words. Word reading, these are regular words. So it's very similar to the decoding test, although there's a little more context in it that they are real words that many of the kids are familiar with, just because they're not nonsense words. Reading accuracy is the level or the percent in which they're reading accurately. Fluency is the rate at which they're reading, and then comprehension we know is the understanding behind it. And like I said, that one only happens in 2nd grade. And then as I mentioned, per Stacy's question earlier, just the dyslexia screener has the vocab, spelling, and RAN components as well.
And so Kim, the nonsense areas of it really help identify that kids aren't basically rotely memorizing,
Right.
like cat, hat, bat, that they use the nonsense words so that you can really assess that they really do know their letters and they're decoding their letter sounds, right? Is that how that works?
Correct. So it's really isolating those skills because they're not reading true words in the English language. There is sometimes, depending on what you read, a little controversy behind that. But yes, you're exactly right. So since we did have a full year with it, we thought we would report out what we liked. Teachers seemed to think it was quick and efficient, which when we're talking about assessments like this, I'm going to point out how we use them as a district, how teachers use them, and being quick and efficient is important because you want to get past the assessment into the teaching and to the learning. And so, having an eye on how the kids are doing, but then being able to use that information the next day to instruct your kids is really the important part. We thought, just like I said, it's really important to use for instruction, to get to know your kids right away, to see if there were any gaps. Thinking back to 2020 fall, we were coming off of spring 2020, and definitely, worried about how our kids fared during that time period as well. This does fit really nicely into our response to intervention plan, and we have focused on it as a district. We focused on reading intervention in particular, so these assessments really kind of helped to formulate what our plans might be and how they might be successful using this data. And then, like we had mentioned already, the dyslexia screener provides additional data in addition to what we've used already. We learned a few things, obviously, from the first year. Our students, first of all, did score well. They scored well overall, and they grew from beginning of year to end of year. And I don't have all the charts that Jamie has, but we do have data that shows we outperformed, the region and the state. We decided that definitely administration with fidelity is important, again, because of those 1-minute tests. There's only so much you can do within a minute. And then the teachers are also scoring it on the spot on their own device while the student is, whether it's reading the word or identifying the letters or whatever it is, the teacher has to score in real time. So fidelity of administering it is very important. We did notice some scoring was not intuitive, and we had some PD around that as well. There are some issues where scoring can be a little subjective, based on the teacher administering it. And then, of course, I already mentioned some students were virtual, while others were in the classroom. But I think the biggest picture, and maybe how this data differs from what you see when you look at STAR data, is that we really use this on the student level. So rather than looking at all of third grade, or sorry, not third grade in this case, but all of second grade or all of kindergarten or all of first grade like we do with STAR, it's really to plan for for instruction on the individual level. So a teacher can pull up the data, and this is something they do with instructional coaches and with others at their campus. They can pull up their data and really identify and hone in, okay, these 3 kids need more help with phonemic awareness. These 4 kids need help with comprehension. These 5 kids need help with fluency. So they're able to use it directly to plan for whole group lessons, small group planning, and again, that RTI, response to intervention, that I mentioned earlier. So while we would like to do a lot of comparisons and pat ourselves on the back, it's really an individual student by student. So those kids that are performing well below, what are we doing for them, and what interventions are happening, and those that are scoring above benchmark, we hope they stay there, but also what are we doing to deepen their learning as well, that we're not just saying, oh, you got it in September, you're good to go. One thing I will point out that I forgot to mention on a previous slide, when I go back to the benchmark scores, the blue, green, yellow, red, those do change from beginning of year to end of year. So for instance, there's a certain subtest I looked at that, you know, obviously 0 was red at the beginning of the year, but 5 points on the raw score was blue at the beginning of the year. So they were above benchmark if they made 5. Well, by the end of the year, those numbers drastically changed. And so to get to score above red, you had to have 36 or higher just to be below benchmark still. And then you had to have something like 56 or 57 or higher to be in the blue. So you can see how it's not an apples to apples comparison from beginning of year to end of year, because the test itself, the benchmark, grows as the year goes on. So with that, here are our scores overall for the district composite. You can see the top score is beginning of year, and then the bottom row is end of year. You can see we also grew with 7 more kids across the district, and you can see the individual numbers and percent that each scored. So obviously they're shifting in between. The bottom number outside of the table shows our at-risk for dyslexia based on M-class. So in kindergarten specifically, they identified 9 as at-risk for dyslexia. As Lisa mentioned before, our Shaywitz casts a little bit wider of a net and has more come out of Shaywitz, and so I think using both is a nice kind of, not quite triangulation because there's only 2, but a nice duality of looking at our students in that way. I'll move on to first grade. And again, you can just see the beginning to end of year and where students fell. And again, I want to reiterate, it's not just about these numbers, it's really about the individual kids. Because it could be that a student was above benchmark at the beginning of the year and then dropped down, or vice versa. So we train teachers to look at individual kids closely and match the instruction and the intervention that needs to happen in the classroom. And for first grade, we had 12 students come up on the screener as at risk for dyslexia. Again, that's not an identification of dyslexia, but it's something to take note of. Second grade, here are our numbers. And while you see things like at benchmark drop from 142 to 121, it's not, you can't really look at it that way because so many more went to above benchmark. So all the numbers are fluctuating in between those 4 columns. It's not necessarily, you can't look down one column necessarily.
Real quick question on dyslexia.
Yes.
So you use the word screener, not identification, and so are those kids just kept an eye on as they progress? Is a Shaywitz used in conjunction for each of those grades? And so I know Shaywitz is a screener too. But how are we, because that number, that percentage seems small compared to what we know in the general population. So how are we casting a wide enough net to get the at-risk population truly to what it is like?
So Kim mentioned the 2 data points we have, but we also have all teacher observation as well. So we would combine that with interventions that we've tried in the classroom, plus we share our in-class data with our dyslexia therapists and talk through all of those pieces to see who might be someone we need to get an eye on for an evaluation. So it may be that many of these students were already evaluated or may already even be in dyslexia services at this point.
I think you said the answer, but I missed it. Is it similar numbers that show up from the Shaywitz assessment?
Shaywitz actually yields more
Okay.
numbers and a higher percentage
Okay.
than this happened to. Again, this was 1 year, and it was a different year. So, you know, as we move on this year, we'll have a little bit more comparison, but Shaywitz definitely gives us a larger percentage of students. Another thing to point out, well below benchmark is definitely concerning to us, but that's not synonymous with somebody who may have dyslexia. So that's where you kind of see a little bit of discrepancy there as well, where, you know, 6% of our students who were well below benchmark at the end of the year is obviously a higher number than the 2% that this assessment, you know, screened for at-risk for dyslexia. But again, using Shaywitz in conjunction with it, which we have for several years now, we think is probably a good way to go and continue.
So going back to the slides, you don't have to go back, but when you gave us the slides of what you liked about Dibbles and then some of the kind of things you have to work around using this test, do most teachers think this is a better test for identifying where their students are?
I think I think it depends who you ask. Some of the tests we've used before are a little more, maybe give us a little more data, but they also, you know, there are pros and cons to every assessment.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of people say they really liked this, and I think it's not about the test itself, it's about how you use the data. And so again, a lot of our PD and a lot of what our coaches do on campus is working with teachers regularly to look at some of this data and plan for instruction. So, you know, we didn't take a poll necessarily about it, but, you know, we got unsolicited feedback, both good and bad, which I think is probably common anytime you have new tools to use.
And in-class was recommended by the state,
For kindergarten.
K through 2 as well.
Oh, I thought it was just for kindergarten.
It's K through 2, but there were 2 particular tests we had to choose from for kindergarten.
Okay,
One of those was a kindergarten only test, and the other one was this.
okay.
And we also had to choose tests for first and second, and of course they don't make it easy, so you know, you have 2 columns of things. The thing that matched up from K through 2 was in class. So that made it a little more consistent, because otherwise you're looking at a completely different test for kindergarten and trying to see if the kids grow into first grade, which makes it more difficult. So what's nice about going into our second year, and the window closes this Friday, so I don't have beginning of year data for you, but what's nice about going into this is the teachers can pull up how their kids, assuming they're in first or second, how their kids scored last year and use some of that comparative data. Obviously our kindergartners, you know, would be brand new, but that consistency piece helped us make this decision. But you're right, there were required for all 3 grade levels, and this matched all 3 of them.
And along those lines, I mean, it sounds like probably what I'm hearing is that the actual administration of it is less time consuming, so that they can use the results more quickly to differentiate teaching, but that in that there may be concern that there may be some pieces, quote unquote, missing, or you're making certain, and that's why the fidelity is so important, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And that's just true of any assessment. I'll also add, these tests that we do periodically that are required are only one piece of the puzzle. So our teachers are constantly assessing, meeting with kids, pulling small groups, and checking on these skills throughout the year. Because we wouldn't just wait to the end of the year and say, oh, that's how we did. So they're constantly checking on these things in their regular, daily practices. Okay, and last but not least, I just took a clip. This is from the website, so these are not our kids. I don't know who Tracy is, but these go home to the parents, and it's a pretty long report, but it basically, the first page tells them what the test is and what it is assessing, and gives sort of a example for parents in language they can understand. And then the second page gives activities for that particular student based on assessment data. So the company itself, auto creates these for each student, and those go home not in a high-tech way. I think they just go home in a folder. So again, for our first year, I thought it was quite successful, and we'll continue to look at the data. This year, I'm eager to get my hands on it after Friday, and we can continue to report back.
And Fountas Pinnell did not do this, correct? You just got a report for your child?
Correct. So Fountas of Pinnell was, again, those pros and cons was more teacher, the teachers had to analyze the data. So because the teacher is inputting it on their own device, be it an iPad or a touchscreen laptop, as the kid is taking it, all of that shoots in, and we can spit out, graphs and information, whereas Fountas of Pinnell was handwritten, and so the teacher really had to understand the results of those things and report that out.
But as a parent, I would get the Fountas Pinnell one back and go, what do I do with this, right? Because if one of my children did need help, it didn't necessarily say, here are activities that you can do. I did hear from a couple parents that said they did like receiving those because they were able to go in and talk with the teacher and find books and work with the librarian and those types of things. So I did hear just from a couple people that said it was nice to get something pragmatic back this
Great.
year.
That's good information. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna steal the clicker from you. All right, true to form, it's always running out of time when I get to mine, so you slow me down if we need to. I want to talk a little bit about Proclamation 2022, which, as you will recall, TEA has a proclamation year, and in that year they declare which TEKS and resources we'll be looking at. This year it happens to be health and PE. So Erica Vandergriff has been working with our health and PE teachers. They drafted during last school year a framework of instructional practices in the areas of health and PE, which will guide the next steps. This year, an adoption committee will convene. That will include our health and PE teachers, some administrators, and they will take a look to review the new TEKS. They will research and recommend the anchor resources using our district's adoption process. I will add that there is an additional requirement from the state, and has been for quite some time now, that the SHAC, or the School Health Advisory Committee, provides input on the human sexuality resources, and so we will continue to do that portion. And of course, as always, all of our adoption processes includes a parent preview opportunity and a feedback opportunity that will be advertised multiple times in our district e-news. And then that team will also then begin developing new curriculum documents, both scope and sequence, and objective guides for use beginning next school year. You as a board will receive the recommendations from this committee for the adopted materials for approval in the spring of 2022. So that's the school year. That seems like a long way away, but it's just around the corner. I want you to also know that House Bill 1525 of this legislative session had some impact on Proclamation 2022. They have put new rules for the School Health Advisory Committee. We now must post those notice of meetings 72 hours in advance, very similar to either a board work session or a board meeting. We also must post those minutes and either an audio or a video recording of the meeting. So we're looking at our capabilities and what will be, whether or not we'll hold those meetings in person or virtually, and so we will keep you posted on that, but we will absolutely meet those requirements. And we also must hold at least 2 public meetings regarding those human sexuality materials prior to adopting the recommendations. So that will be part of the SHAC's role in doing that. It also requires in House Bill 1525 that all proposed materials for human sexuality to be presented to you at a public meeting, and rather than a consent agenda item, that must be a record vote of the trustees for the human sexuality materials. So my guess is we'll do all of the health, PE, and human sexuality together, but we will be presenting all of that to you. Additional requirements in House Bill 1525, and by the way, if 1525 is ringing a bell, it's one of those what I would call a kitchen sink bill. It includes funding, it includes CTE calculations, it includes gifted, all kinds of interesting things, and then lo and behold, you get upon this section having to do with human sexuality. So I'm not talking about all of House Bill 1525, I'm talking about the pieces that are included here. It also requires a notice before the school year of our human sexuality content and a general schedule of instruction. We took care of that as recommended by TASB by placing that in the student handbook this year. So you will see a summary that Erica worked with our teachers to provide of what those topics are and what that general schedule of instruction will be. That is still the current TEKS. So this school year would still have the same topics that have been in place now for 18, 20 years. Next year that will change with the new TEKS, and so of course that notice will also change. It also requires a written consent or an opt-in for human sexuality instruction. I will tell you, as a team, we had already made the decision that we wanted with the new TEKS our human sexuality instruction to be an opt-in process. This legislation had us put that opt-in a year earlier with the old information, but we will certainly have that and have been working with principals and teachers on that opt-in process for this year. It also requires any public domain resources for human sexuality to be published on the website, and it requires purchase agreements, anything we make for materials that we purchase after September 1 of this year, that we work with the company in the contract to make it able for parents to purchase a copy of those materials at the district's purchase price. That does not mean the district has to purchase those for parents, but that they would be available for parents to purchase if they wanted to do so. So as we work with vendors this year on appropriate materials, we'll make sure that any we would recommend to you would absolutely have the ability to meet that legislative requirement.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Absolutely.
Going back, when you say that to put notice ahead of the school year for any content in the schedule is gone in the student handbook, but then we also ask for written consent.
Yes, so that will mean we have the student handbook piece, which will give parents a typical idea, like you're going to see this in the first semester or second semester, but then no later than 14 days prior to instruction, parents will receive detailed information about the instruction, the resources, and have not really the opportunity, have the requirement to opt in.
So they'll get notice twice, essentially.
Correct. But if they want to know when to be on the lookout for it, that is already out there. Other questions about Proclamation 2022? Lots of new requirements that we'll be working through as we go through this year.
Is everything encapsulated within that same House Bill 1525? I mean, is Proclamation 22 a subset of House Bill 1525?
So Proclamation 22 is just part of TEA's normal yearly cycle of adoption. House Bill 1525 layered on some additional requirements for us to follow through that proclamation process, adoption process.
And Lisa, just for clarification, the human sexuality piece is embedded in the health portion. Is it also pieces of it in PE, or is it all in health right now?
Well, that's a great question, because as we look at the new TEKS, we're going to have to look at some of that. Currently, A student could get human sexuality content, typically in health, but it can also come in science. So Erica's made note of that in the handbook of when those science topics come around.
Right, and that's what I was trying to get across, is that we may be crossing multiple subjects right
Correct.
now. Do you anticipate that will change in the future and it will all be embedded in health?
I do
Because
not.
health
I
is a state
anticipate that it will
requirement.
continue to cross multiple content areas.
And when it crosses multiple content areas, is the science within a certain grade level, or is it all grade levels, or is it?
Typically, it's just certain grade levels and classes. So if you get into an anatomy class, you're going to hit some human sexuality pieces. Certain grade levels of science will have certain things about biology and systems. So we'll try to point those out. And again, we've done that for this year. I can't give you 100% for next year because we're still ironing out all the new TEKs, but we'll make sure we clarify all that when we present that.
And Lisa, in the crosswalk that you do between old TEKs and new TEKs, will you all also identify at that point what classes, like which
Yes.
classes and what grades, so that
Yes.
people can very clearly see?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. That is part of the task for Erica and her team this year. And I know she's excited. All right. Another very quick legislative update in Senate Bill 15. There's been a lot of conversation about virtual instruction, and Senate Bill 15 was recently authorized to say that LEAs may receive funding for local remote learning through either synchronous, asynchronous, or a combination for K through 12. They were very clear that pre-K does not qualify. That's the only grade level they eliminated. It does leave a cap of 10% of all enrolled students for whom a district may draw funding for remote learning. Students must meet state eligibility requirements, and specifically, if you look at the legislation and then the following guidance from TEA, if a student was remote all last year and failed to meet the approaches grade level standard on a STAR test, that student is not eligible to draw funding as a remote student. In addition, the state's guidance allows the local education agency to add additional eligibility requirements. So that's just another aside. It does require the development of a plan to implement. And if you will recall, last year we worked really hard to develop our asynchronous learning plan through TEA. Spent quite a bit of time developing that, getting that approved. I don't believe that the approval process looks the same this year, but the requirement of a plan to be posted online is still part of the requirements. And again, we just received the guidance from the state on Thursday, so we're still trying to make sense of what that looks like. What they were clear about, however, is that teachers may not deliver instruction concurrently. So I mentioned earlier that our 5th through 12th grade teachers last year, all of our remote programming was done concurrently. That would not be a possibility. The other thing that really makes it different this year for 2021 is, you will recall last year we started the year with a virtual option. So we asked parents, are you interested? We knew who we had. We did some adjusting of staff. We pulled some grade level teachers to be virtual teachers. I think you will recall the difficulty in moving kids in and out of classrooms and teachers back and forth throughout the year. That is not something that we are looking to do. We're not looking to pull a teacher out of a classroom right now and declare a virtual teacher. That would be completely disruptive to the entire system right now. So we have a lot of different parameters. So it's not like we can take last year and just say, hey, let's just replicate that this year, because the rules have completely changed. So currently, we're offering a parent-led program. It certainly is not as robust as what we offered last year, but there are but approximately a little over 20 students participating in K-6 in that program. We did receive the guidance last week, the parameters for virtual funding. That came both in an administrator letter and also in some proposed language for the student attendance accounting handbook. And so we're trying to work through all of that. So really what I'm here to tell you is I don't have a lot of answers, but we are looking at whether or not it's even feasible based on the staff that we have. We do not have staff just sitting around that we can pull to just start doing virtual tomorrow, so that is a real challenge for us to overcome, but that's kind of where we are. And again, the state has not said we are required to offer it. I've been dipsticking some friends of mine in other districts, and I'm hearing of some who are and some who aren't, so we are looking at the feasibility for us.
So can I ask a couple clarifying questions, Lisa? Hybrid, just to put it in layman's terms, is no-go. So
Correct.
as we continue to receive emails, that's just no-go.
That is
Basically,
clearly not allowed.
A standalone something if it's offered.
Correct.
K through 6 only?
It will allow you to do K through 12, but again, we have to look at the feasibility and whether or not that's the right choice for us to make.
Yeah, with no concurrent, that would mean you'd have to have a whole separate biology teacher and algebra 2 teacher and geometry teacher
Correct.
if you were to offer that. And
Correct.
the odds of having a class full of people, it's very, very difficult to plan for that, not knowing exactly who would take it. I mean, I'm sort of reliving a lot of the things we tried to work out last year.
Right.
So,
You're reliving the challenges, yes.
Let me just emphasize what I think Tom said. Realistically, we would not be looking at a virtual program grades 7 through 12. We would not be able to pull that off. The only potential we have is possibly K through 6, and we really have to take a hard look at that to determine if that really is a viable alternative for us and what the interest might be and what the advantages might be in terms of educating kids.
And from a funding perspective, is this separate funding or would it fall under ESSER funding?
So this would, what Senate Bill 15 allows is for us to receive ADA for the students. Currently, those students who are in parent-led we are not receiving any funding for those. They are enrolled, but they are currently absent in terms of TEA. Okay, so I'm gonna put my question slide up and show you that picture of that landscape, because I remember last year saying, well, we were thinking this, and then this changed, and then the guidance changed, and it feels a little frustrating because you want to have all the answers all the time, and you want to be able to say, sure, we know exactly what that's going to look like, and certainly our team has been wrestling with what ifs and what could we and what are the possibilities, but it's so hard to play that game when you don't know the rules. So, we need some time to take a look at it now that we know the rules. So, one minute we think we're standing in the middle of the green grass there, and then there's suddenly another mountain to climb for us. So that is just kind of what it feels like. I know it feels like that for you as board members as well, but I just, I want to acknowledge the rocky terrain that our whole team has been encountering.
well, I mean, Lisa, I'll just say in response to that, some of what you're sharing with us right now has been changing in the last 10 or 15 days. I mean, normally all this stuff we locked in place a year ahead of time, we can plan on it. And so, so the landscape is certainly changing around you. So thank you for the update. I know that you would prefer to have something fully baked and tell us
Sure.
exactly what to expect, but thanks for giving us a real-time update.
I guess we're still pivoting. Even though I refuse to use that word, I guess we're still pivoting. So, thank you very much, Lisa, and all of your team that's here. Jamie, Kim, I thought I saw Erica back there. Erica's back there. So they put in a lot of time and energy to make sure that we get to review this. And it really is an important part of what we do is student achievement and what's happening in the classroom and that type of thing. Lisa, was there anything else? We had various topics next. Okay.
I did not have anything else, and I apologize. I think I went over time.
Any board members, any topics, anything else we need to discuss? Okay, then if I can have a request a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn the September 14th Education Services Work Session.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second it.
13 seconds. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yes, thank you guys.
So good at that.